So I'll get started with introductions, and that will give people a little more time to hopefully log in and connect. And like I said, please, as you have questions, please type them in the chat, and I will make sure that we share that. We will also be going through many of the questions that people had submitted beforehand. But thank you all for attending. My name is Georgette Stephens. I'm the Executive Director of the Downtown Albany Business Improvement District. And I want to thank my counterparts in the Capital Region. We have 6 bids actually represented. So it's myself, Central Avenue, Downtown Schenectady, Lark Street, Troy, and then there's also the Upper Union bid. I know that they also sent information out to some of their stakeholders. And I think, we spent a lot of time in the really communicating the original mandates that were required for closures and the like, then sending out information on the various grant programs and loan programs that were available. And so we're excited to really now be focusing on reopening as well, right? We're excited that reopening is part of the conversation, which a couple weeks ago it really hadn't been. And so we thought, who best to bring in but the New York State Restaurant Association. And so Melissa Fieschut has been with the New York Restaurant Association for 22 years. And so they are the largest hospitality association in New York State. And so not only does Melissa represent the restaurants at the state level, but she also participates at the national level as well. And so we have her, as well as Dominic Purnomo, who I'm assuming most of you probably know, but with DP's and Yonos, one of the owners there, sommelier, and he is also a member. He's a director on the board at the New York State Restaurant Association. So I know both of them have been active in both the state and the national negotiations and advocacy for restaurants as we go through COVID-19 and start talking about reopening. So I know I don't really, they actually participated with the upstate New York bids and had a conversation with them on Friday. And so we don't really need to go into the what are you seeing statewide, what are restaurants experiencing it, because all of you obviously are experiencing it firsthand. But I did think it would be, we talked about statewide in the last month and a half, anticipated $5.5 billion in revenue losses. We have seen so far some restaurants that have closed, and we anticipate that number may continue depending on when New York, is unpaused, as we call it. But do you want to, Melissa, maybe talk a little bit about some of the advocacy work that you guys are doing? I know we've heard from many of you the challenges with the PPP program and how those efforts are going, and what you see as potentially other, if you anticipate other financial resources coming from the federal government and what they might look like.
Sure. So the New York State Restaurant Association has a partnership relationship with the National Restaurant Association, and they do all of our advocacy work at the federal level with Congress and all of the U.S. agencies, including the President's office as well. So we've been working with them on messaging and action alerts to try and get PPP to be the payroll protection plan to be a better program than it currently is for the restaurant industry. When it first came out, it initially looked like it was going to be a good program and was going to make sense, but as it got implemented and was incredibly underfunded, and the limited guidance that we were getting out of Treasury and SBA became problematic, we realized that there were a number of things that didn't make sense. And as we've watched other states start to reopen, they may have a better ability to use PPP funding, but it's certainly going to be very challenging for the restaurant industry here in New York to take advantage of the funds that come for the payroll protection program in light of the fact that we may or may not be open in 8 weeks from the day that you get funded. So that's an additional challenge for those states that have not reopened yet. Some of the things that we're asking Congress to look at is, could we have flexibility in when that 8-week period is applied so that it doesn't start the clock ticking the day you get the funding? Could they extend the deadline for the 8 weeks to end instead of being at the end of June? Could they push it out as far as the end of the year? Can they, Treasury and SBA, change the terms of that payback period to the original 10-year payback period that Congress intended instead of the limited 2-year period that's currently in the guidelines? There was a new document issued yesterday from Treasury talking about how if you go to hire an employee back and they refuse to come back because unemployment might be a better situation for them now than putting them back on payroll through the payroll protection program, that wouldn't count against you for forgiveness of your PPP. So that was a good step forward, one of the changes we had been asking for. But there's still a lot more that needs to change for PPP to make sense for the restaurant industry. We're also asking for them to look at the 25-75 percentage breakdown. 75% has to be used on payroll, where only 25% can be used on things like rent or mortgage interest or utilities. We feel that if there was more flexibility in the program, it would be a better use of the funds for the restaurant industry, especially in areas where rent could be significantly more towards New York City and the like. So we've asked for a number of changes. We've also asked for a dedicated fund for the restaurant industry. A restaurant industry relief fund is the way they've named it. And we've been talking to representatives in Congress about the potential for that, since so much of the PPP money went to other industries, and we feel like we have a strong case that the restaurant industry was one of the hardest hit industries in the country. I don't know if they've gotten a lot of traction on that or not. Unfortunately, my call with the National Restaurant Association is at 3:30 today, so my latest update is after this call. But I do know that that's something that they're working on. And they're also looking at the best way to approach the business interruption insurance issue. We've heard a lot of discussion around that from our restaurant owners across the state, that they're being told their coverage won't cover the pandemic, and that their business interruption insurance, when they have filed a claim, has been denied. So those are some of the issues that we're looking at the federal level that we feel could really help the industry.
Hopefully you are aware of one program that was just launched, I think maybe towards the end of last week. It's through the Capital Region Community Loan Fund. And so they are accepting applications. If you haven't already applied, you can go to their website. It's up to $20,000. It is a grant. And they are, to be honest, I'm not sure their total dollar amount of funding that they have right now in that program, but they are continuing to identify resources for that. And so I think in order to qualify, I don't know if it's 20 employees or less or 50 employees or less, but you have to be a small business, and you needed to seen a decrease of 25% or more in your profits, in your sales. So that is currently open, and they are accepting applications. So that's one resource, and it is grant, not loan money. So I highly recommend people also look at that, look at their website if you haven't already. So I think, so there's two questions. One is, given everything that, the governor laid out his 4-phased plan earlier, yesterday, I think it was, but then he hasn't quite said, he said currently all New York State regions don't meet the 7 requirements. And so we're wondering, a lot of people, the biggest question is, when do we really think that we are going to be opening? And we're wondering if, given the negotiations that you guys are doing with the state, the conversations you're having at the state level, do you have any ideas or anticipation of when that might be?
I still don't have any real idea what the dates look like. I mean, the best case scenario, as you pointed out, would be probably somewhere mid-June. You know, if one of the regions were to reach all the points that he's looking for in terms of hospitalization and tracing and testing and all those things, then we have that 2-week phase when construction and manufacturing opens. Then we have a second phase for another 2 weeks. And then the third phase right now is listed as possible restaurants reopening. So it would be 4 weeks away from any time the region finally meets all of the criteria. So I
we're
guess at a minimum of mid-June.
Earliest is mid-June. So talk a little bit about, you know, the governor has said, submit to us your plan of reopening businesses, right? So what is that? What are, I know we've talked a little bit about it being based on the National Restaurant Association's recommended guidelines. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that might look like for businesses?
Sure. So the National Restaurant Association's guidelines are deliberately broad. They're trying to look at how to write guidelines that would cover various aspects of the industry. So the industry, as you know, all of you here represent, is a lot of different restaurants, a lot of different types of establishments, anything from a food truck to a diner to fine dining, catering halls, bars. Like, how do we write plans and guidelines that would meet all of the criteria for that? So the guidelines we have and that we've shared so far have been very broad in terms of, yes, we will properly social distance. Yes, we will follow all the guidelines of the CDC and the health department. We will make sure that our sanitation protocols are in place and being followed. I mean, something all the restaurateurs do on a regular basis. We anticipate that, you know, everyone's stepping that up and working with their teams to make sure that they're trained or retrained if you know, we get to a point where we're reopening, so that all those things are happening on a regular basis and working to rebuild both the staff confidence and the consumer confidence as we get closer to bringing everybody back. That, however, has led to additional conversations with Lieutenant Governor Hochul and former Lieutenant Governor Bob Duffy for those regions. They're regional leaders in the Finger Lakes and Western New York. And actually, Lieutenant Governor Hochul has suggested we try to work on a more specific plan for the different segments of the industry. So this morning on our board of directors call, we talked about working on a plan for bars, working on a plan for full service restaurants, caterers, and quick service restaurants. So those 4 segments, and really working around the challenges that each of them would face and how to address some of those concerns and submitting plans for those segments of the industry. Because each of them has unique challenges that they'll have to address in a little more specific way. But again, we are trying really hard to stay broad and not talk about occupancy or seating capacity, and talk about social distancing instead, because we think that that's a better way for us to approach it, because it's going to look different in all those different types of restaurants, and everybody's establishment has different parameters that they have to try and figure out how social distancing works in their restaurant.
So I guess I'll ask Dominic, you know, as you've been part of these conversations and as you're trying to think how does that really play out within your restaurant, right? So we've seen in South Carolina, they only open to outdoor seating, or, you know, Georgia, I think, are they at 50% capacity? And then, you know, in China, and in some places in Europe, they're doing plexiglass. So a lot of people are wondering, do you think like those will actually be some specific requirements? And how do you envision rolling, like the disposable menus, you know, how do you envision rolling some of these things out within your own restaurant?
You know, as things have progressed and moved along, everything changes so rapidly. So, you hear one set of, directives coming from the state, and then so you formulate a plan, and then, less than a week later, there's another set of plans. Okay, back to the drawing board. Obviously the big thing is going to be, continuing social distancing. Some of the things that we've heard coming from the governor's offices, I should say, because I think there's 7 of them working together on this, is, opening at a 25 to 30% of your maximum capacity. Obviously for most restaurants that doesn't work, especially not being able to have a bar, because you can't have a bar and have bar stools 6 feet apart, because that's not going to work for anybody. So I think what it is trying to figure out where do we fit into that plan. And as Melissa said earlier on the call, that we're trying to formulate plans, because just looking at this, thinking of places in downtown Albany, in Yonos where the tables excuse me, are already 6 or 8 or 10 feet apart. That's one thing, versus a place like Dawn's across the street from me, which is much tighter tables, versus across the street from them at the Hollow, where they count on a lot of their revenue for the live music and putting people in. So it's not like there's going to wave a magic wand and say, okay, if you serve food and beverage, you're going to be open. Things like disposable menus, not setting tables ahead of time. Disposable menus, that's great, but as printing ink and paper and all those things are expensive. So we already have now are an industry that's 8 months without revenue or drastically reduced revenue. What do we do there? Do we lean on distributors to get us 50-inch TVs with the menu on that, and it sits up on the wall, and it's serves as a chalkboard menu? Do we do one menu per table? And they're already discussing no mixed households at tables, limiting table capacity. Obviously, all of these things that at least certainly not in the first few weeks or months are we going to be able to. It's not going to be girls' night out. It's not going to be 6 or 8 friends getting together for dinner. Maybe you and your nucleus family, could go out to dinner. But it's trying to anytime you come up with an idea for one of these ideas, there's something else that comes through. There seems to be another layer of, red tape that sort of puts the kibosh on that. So, as Melissa had said earlier, best case scenario, we're looking mid-June. I tempered that by saying, as phase 1 opens up, if all those metrics are met, in the next couple of weeks, all of a sudden, if those numbers start to trend higher again, we're punting the ball down the field for another 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. So, best case scenario, we're opening up, mid-June. But, what does that look like from now? And all of a sudden, if those numbers start to trend up again, it's a slower process. And then maybe they tighten up the restrictions. Okay, now you're going to open up at 20%, or, maybe now, you can only, some people talk about disposable cutlery, but, obviously washing and sanitizing all those things is not a concern, but, you certainly have servers bringing stuff to tables. Obviously, if you're a casual restaurant, you can't have anything out in a caddy. So as much as I would love to, we'd be able to present the plan, there's just still so many things that discuss that. We talked about on the bid call on Friday with the statewide bids, people are talking about putting plexiglass up between, if they have back-to-back booths and things like that. But okay, then you build a bigger mousetrap. Now that's something that needs to get, it's another place for bacteria, virus to land. So that's yet another cleaning, sanitizing, washing step in between. So it's certainly it's a bear to get your arms around as far as how many precautions we need to take.
So I have one specific question that was, do you anticipate that staff and or guests will be required to wear face masks?
Yes, and yes. And I also would assume that all people coming into your building will have to have temporal lobe thermometer checks. Those temperatures will have to be logged. And this is going to be all part about contact tracing, because if Georgette Stephens comes into DP and she winds up testing positive, we need to run through everybody else who was in the restaurant that day and had contact with her. Every employee that was working that day and had contact. And then all the people that they had contact with. So that is going to be, it's sort of, it's an invasion of privacy. Are people going to want that? Are they going to want to come into your restaurant and know that, their 5-year-old child's temperature is going to be taken by a stranger? That's not a nurse. So these are all the things that, as we're hearing these ideas, these are all the, the things that come into my head. Do you have to have a male and a female person checking temperature, much like the TSA, so to make sure that people are comfortable? These are all the things that, we're still trying to shake out as they come to us. But yeah, certainly going to be masks for a while, presumably gloves. Temperature checks, I think, are a reality. If you haven't ordered your temporal lobe thermometers, I would certainly suggest doing those now, because they're already prices are already going up on those, and availability is scarce. So get ahead of it.
A couple other questions. Do you anticipate that there'll be restricted hours of operations? And when do you think, what period of time do you think it will take to go from 25 to 30% of open to 100% of open? Are we talking 3 months, 6 months, a year? What do you guys think that will look like?
I don't think hours of operation are going to be a factor as much as I think that would be more on our end as operators and as owners of restaurants, because obviously you're going to want to focus the max amount of operation within a small amount of time to maximize your labor. But I think it's all going to be about percentage of occupancy is going to be the biggest thing that is going to be regulated. I'm sorry, what's the second part of that?
Yeah, before we move on, there was a second question about face masks, and would a restaurant be able to restrict someone from entering their business if they don't have a face mask on?
I know it. What are they doing at the grocery stores? I know they suggest it by state and local law, but I don't know that I've seen anybody not wearing it.
Yeah, so I think some of them have people standing out. Like you said, it's an extra additional cost of really that enforcement. So.
And then, what happens? We have to ask that person to leave. That's,
yeah.
We're not policemen. I don't know how that works.
Right. That was expressed.
Yeah.
As a concern.
I think that's, you're going to ask people to do something. And then if they don't wear a mask, they're going to make people uncomfortable near them. Yeah. It's a lot.
And so then the other question about how long you think, do you or Melissa anticipate it will take to get up to that 100%?
I really don't have a good answer to that. Dominic already hit on the points here that, if they limit occupancy or they limit capacity in some way beyond just saying, 6 feet of social distancing throughout the restaurant, you're probably, if we're below 50% in any way, shape, or form, a lot of restaurants I don't think are going to open because it just doesn't make sense. The numbers don't work. If we get 2 weeks in between to see how the numbers go, that might be the way they go, but we haven't heard anything about percentages or what the percentage limits would be or how quickly they would go up. Would they go up by 25%? There hasn't been one conversation I've had where we've been discussing percentage of occupancy and what the measures would be to decide that it would be limited to X and then go to Y and how long in between it would take. Haven't heard that at all yet.
And it's all going to come down to rate of infection. If that number stays, 0.09 or 0.9, whatever it is, I think that, you'll start to see, the faster that the rate of economy will move, the rate of opening the economy will move, I should say. And then, on our end, once we can open, how quickly the rate of occupancy can move up. But I think it's all going to reflect upon those numbers. And if you see a sharp spike, they're going to pull the reins back. And then again, maybe instead of what maybe they were thinking 2 weeks, now it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks. It's all about controlling the rate of infection, and that's the biggest thing.
So I've seen in places where restaurants are only allowed to do reservation only, that you can't walk in. Do you, I know obviously many of the restaurants don't necessarily have waiting rooms or lobbies for people to wait for the table to be ready. I think, Dominic, we talked a little bit about texting services. How do you see reservations and people waiting to get in for their table? How do you see that happening?
I think, and again, this, probably goes for sit down casual dining and up would be, utilizing reservation services, Resi, Open Table, any of the other ones that are out there, or call ahead, typical pick up the phone, call ahead and make a reservation. And then, once you can reserve their tables, but then it would also, if you have a more casual place like a pizzeria or you have a pub or something like that, I would think, people would come up with a time where they would, you give you a number and, you call them with a time, or, people would try to come in or walk in and say, we'll have a table ready in 30 minutes. Give us your cell phone number, go wait in your car. Sadly, because there's no, 2 months ago, you would have just said, "Oh, go have a seat at the bar. We'll come get you when your table's available," or have a seat in our lobby or in our vestibule or or what have you. If you didn't have a table ready, obviously, having a critical mass of people, from mixed households waiting for table is not, is going to be one of the things that's going to slow us down the most as far as getting fully reopened again. So, I think people are going to have to get creative with that. If the weather is nicer, maybe you can set up a couple high top tables outside, socially distanced apart so that people can congregate out there. And, now that we can take cocktails to go, you can certainly sell them drinks out there and things like that. So there's, hopefully some options depending. And again, each place is different. Are you in a mall? Are you in a small place in downtown? Are you out in the suburbs with lots of area? One of the things that we've discussed in the state level is, and also locally in Albany is relaxing the ideas for cafe permits. And well, maybe you can only, if your maximum capacity is for 150 people inside and you could open at 30% minus your staff. So now you're down to, 35 or so, but you have a 100-car parking lot. You could set up socially distant tables out in your parking lot on a nice day. Again, how often do we get that in upstate New York? Where it's not 95 degrees and blistering hot, or it's not windy, or there's, not mosquitoes everywhere, or it's not raining or cold or gray, but those would be other options as well. So, those are things that on the state level with the Restaurant Association that we're advocating for is, to allow people the opportunity that if they do have, again, parking lot space, Georgette, we discussed it in the other bid meeting, about using, opening up parking spots, that are on the street, so on and so forth. So a lot of it's going to be creativity, and everybody on this, 42 of you know your businesses better than I do. So what your assets and what you have available to you, and it's, going to be it's going to be a game of just getting creative and seeing where you can best utilize what you have.
Yeah, I know that, Dominic, about that we've talked about maybe taking over a couple parking spots in front of a business and building a parklet for additional seating. The big concern there, so any help that Melissa, you or Dominic could do with the SLA is that because it isn't directly adjacent to your business, they don't necessarily want to have the liquor license. They don't want to necessarily allow a liquor license in a little parklet there. And so it sounds like because of this pandemic, they seem a little more open to it, but any assistance you could do in advocating for that would be greatly appreciated, because I know the more space we can give people, particularly outdoor space, because I know we'll talk about consumer confidence in a little bit, is critical. So one of the things that you guys had talked about was the idea of touchless. And so one of the questions was, do we think that this will most likely move us in a direction of restaurants stopping accepting cash? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's the way things are going anyway. Delivery and takeout certainly have led us to have a lot more contactless payments and that system in place for takeout and delivery during the pandemic. The question becomes, though, we represent the whole state. New York City has a law in place that prevents you from going cashless because they have so many residents in New York City that are considered underbanked. It was a term I'd never even heard before. They started passing legislation on it in New York City. So I don't know that we'll be able to go completely cashless, but I think, due to consumer demand, you're going to see less use of cash as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I never have cash on me anyway, or rarely have cash on me. But even right now, I'd be even more reluctant, just because of that. But I also understand that. I mean, I have probably several employees, and I'm sure many people on here do, who, as Melissa said, are underbanked, and they don't. They pay their rent in cash. They pay, their car payment in cash. They pay, they're primarily cash. So, I think for certain restaurants. They may be, I think there's going to be people who need to be serviced who, without cash, they don't have credit cards, they don't have a bank card, they don't have any other mode of plastic. I know that there are some restaurants who are cash only or cash under a certain area. I think I would probably recommend getting away from that. If you can take plastic, take it, so you could bring a contactless payment system to the table. And try to mitigate as little exposure to not only your guests but your staff as well. But I don't think it'll be legislated that nobody can take cash anymore.
One question someone submitted was if they've already made modifications to their business to allow for. So I think we talked about this morning on our staff call, trying to move from social distancing, because I think particularly what we do as business improvement districts, and I think what restaurants do, is you want that social aspect to being physical distancing, right? So maybe trying to change that language to be about the physical 6-foot space, not the social aspect and component of it. But if someone has already made some improvements to their space to allow for accommodating the 6-foot physical distancing requirement, is there someone they could submit their plan to, or is it in order to reopen? Because the governor keeps on saying, submit your plan to me, submit your idea, and then we'll deem if you can be open. Or is it really going to be industry by industry and not individual businesses?
My sense is that they don't have the ability to actually look at it business by business. I don't know. I mean, to me, that sounds overwhelming. 50,000 eating and drinking establishments in the state of New York. If they got 50,000 plans, they would spend nothing, all their day looking at just individual restaurant plans on how to reopen. So I don't know that that's possible for them to handle that kind of volume of individual plans, or if they really need more of the organizations to step up and present plans on behalf of the industry. I certainly think that's easier. And again, that's why we're trying to be a little broader in our discussions and provide options, because, going back to your comment about paper menus, you don't have to do a paper menu if you have a menu board, if you have a chalkboard, if you were having the patron access the menu on their cell phone. All those would be other ways of getting around having a paper menu. So to mandate paper disposable menus seems like a waste to me. So I think having options available makes more sense. My guess is that Empire State Development would be the organization to submit your plan to, just because I know they've been the ones that have been deciding who's essential, who's not essential, and handling those conversations and waivers for different business entities. So that would be my guess, unless you had somebody directly that you could contact at New York Forward. But I would think that it would be Empire State Development that would approve the plans moving forward.
Yeah, and I don't know that they're going to
posted a question, or really more asking for some advocacy. And we had talked a little bit about delivery and the amount of money that delivery sort of charges. they take out on top. And then the question someone else had written was, is there anyone who's advocating to keep credit card processing fees down as they continue to rise if we are going in a contactless credit card or, cashless environment? Is that something that you guys are actively engaged in?
So this has been more of an issue for us towards New York City, and there is legislation pending there to limit the fees of the third-party delivery companies. I haven't seen much on this from a state activity level so far. I think if we were successful in getting this done in New York City, that we could definitely take that model and move it statewide. But the credit card issue, I believe, is a federal issue, and I believe the National Restaurant Association has already weighed in on that, asking for rates to be considered as we, continue to move more and more to that model for touchless and contactless payments. So I believe that's already being addressed at the federal level. Not that it'll be successful necessarily, but they have taken up the issue and are advocating for that.
Now, what?
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, shortly after the beginning of the year, the laws change as far as being able to add a credit card surcharge to your receipts, and that's something you should speak with your credit card processor about, because I'm not sure that they're all handling it that way. But you would be able to put that in as a line item on a check. I mean, it needs to be that. It can't just be a percentage. There's certain speculations, like if it's $100 check, it can't just say 2.7% for credit cards. It has to say $2.70, et cetera. But there is a way for you to legally pass those surcharges onto your guests. But there is a list of speculation of specificities there that need to be met for people to be able to do that.
So I think generally the sentiment is, what can we do to help to make sure we're meeting these requirements, that we're advocating to the appropriate people to ensure that we are able to open. And then also the other concern is that there's enough notice about what these new requirements will be so that people can open under these new guidelines if it's phased and it's 2 weeks and you don't get the new guidelines quick enough, you may not be ready to open. So what can we do to help move this process forward? And then how do we ensure that there's enough education and timing, so that people are ready to open when they're allowed to open?
I guess I would say, Georgette, I shared with you what we had for the National Restaurant Association guidelines.
Everyone.
Okay.
It's on this call. So you guys should have received a link. You may not have read through the whole thing, but there is a link to the National Restaurant Association guidelines for opening, their recommended guidelines for opening. And then there also is, we're going to talk a little bit about consumer confidence and something that the New York State Restaurant Association is doing. So that would have been sent to you with a reminder, the most recent reminder you would have gotten about today's event. So it would have happened maybe half an hour before the meeting. Sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. So I guess, take a look at those guidelines and at least get thinking about what it would mean for your restaurant to meet those guidelines. And then if there's ideas that all of you want to share as, we start to put together a plan, I can tell you quite honestly, the biggest challenge we're having isn't really thinking through the full service restaurant or the quick service restaurant as much as the catering events and the bars. So if there's ideas on how you would meet good physical distancing requirements, I guess we'll start changing the vernacular right now, physical distancing requirements and sanitation and safety standards going forward in those facilities, and you have ideas as to how to make it work better, let them, please send them to me, send them to Georgette, send them to Dominic. happy to talk through those ideas and try to find as many options as we can to put into a plan to submit and get approved. That's what we're finding is the best way to work through this. We have a caterers call Wednesday morning with a lot of the big banquet hall caterers around the state, and they've been surprisingly forward thinking in what a new normal event might look like, how you might do a 100-person wedding in a banquet facility and make it safe and properly physical distance. So, the more we can think through those ideas and get everybody's best thoughts on making it work, I think the better the plan could be.
Do you want to, hopefully most of you have seen Steve Barnes did he did an online survey about asking people how comfortable they'd feel like when they would return back to going out to restaurants. He also did one that was on arts and entertainment, live music, that kind of thing. And so I think it was around 40 to 45% said that they would immediately come back to restaurants and come back often. But there was also about 40% that said they may not come in the first 6 months, or that they wouldn't come back. I think, or they would come back, but maybe not that often. So there is still a big hesitation on the consumer's part. Definitely the restaurants deemed fared far better than the entertainment, because I think it was the exact opposite, that people really didn't feel comfortable coming back to arts and entertainment. Although Dominic and I were talking, when we were talking on Friday, a lot of our restaurants also rely on the events that happen at Proctor's or the Egg, Troy Music Hall, all of those. So one of the things we've been talking about as BIDs, and I know that the New York State Restaurant Association has been talking about, is how do you help instill consumer confidence? So Melissa, do you want to talk about your New York promise?
Sure. So again, this is one of the ideas that we've taken from some of our other counterparts around the country. Actually, Texas Restaurant Association came up with the idea first, but they've developed a restaurant promise. And the idea behind it is a way to, put in writing all the things that you're going to do to help your guests feel safe and comfortable, and then what in turn you're going to ask your guests to do to help you comply with all these new regulations. So we have shared that. We shared it publicly for the first time last night, and have been giving it out to the New York Reopening Task Force members. Georgette has it and has sent it out as well. And it's basically, some of the things that Dominic's already talked about. We'll follow good CDC guidelines on, checking symptoms, and we will keep our restaurants safe and clean like we always do. We will properly physically distance. Maybe we'll change that verbiage in the promise. I don't know. But, those are all the things that we're going to promise to do to meet all the requirements as we go forward. And then in turn, we ask, if you're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms as defined by the CDC, you'll stay home. You won't come in the restaurant. That, you will order takeout and delivery to your house and not come in and endanger the guests and the employees that are working hard to bring us back to normal. You'll be patient and kind as we all go through these new guidelines and regulations and try to figure them out and deal with them as best we can. So things like that are in the promise, and it's just a way for us to put it out there that we're trying our best, and these are the things that we're going to do to keep you safe and healthy, and what we expect from you in return.
So again, that also was included. If you go back in your confirmation email that you received this afternoon, you'll find a link there. And then, like I said, we'll send out a link to this recording, and we'll include those pieces again, so that people, if you didn't see them, or if you already deleted that email, that you can get a second copy. I want to be cognizant of time. I also, I have one more question that I received, and then want to give people an opportunity if there's anything we haven't covered. And I do want to say that as restaurateurs, I know most of you aren't shy, for sure. And so we, as BIDs, want to hear, are there things that we need to be advocating for at the city level that would be helpful for your business? Or, one of the things Dominic and I talked about was, is there some bulk purchasing opportunities for thermometers, for gloves, and for masks, right? Could we do it at a countywide level, at a city level? What are those things that we can do to make sure that you guys have enough and that you're also not being taken advantage of there? Please make sure you reach out to your respective BIDs, because we really want to hear how we can ensure that reopening is as best as it can be, I guess. But so I have two actually questions. One was, is the CDC, do they have any requirements for the thermometer, the temporal thermometer? Is there any specific requirements that you're seeing about what that thermometer would be or look like, or have, functionalities it might have or anything? I'm assuming that's a no based on the look on
Yeah,
you guys.
I think any temporal lobe thermometer, and obviously you'll have to have alcohol wipes to sanitize it after each.
And then the other question that had, which I think we also talked about on Friday, was the supply chain, the restaurant supply chain, and are you guys seeing any movement on that? Is there anything? Are you seeing any issues in some of the states that have reopened? What do you think about?
I mean, as we've probably seen in the media, there's been several meat processing plants, which are unique in the fact that they're probably as tight working spaces as restaurant kitchens are. So obviously that is something to keep in the back of your mind for when we do reopen. But there's been some outbreaks there, and I think that there has been some interruptions in the supply chain, or some slowing. But I mean, for the most part, Americans are eating the same amount of food that they've always eaten. They're just getting it from grocery stores or from Blue Apron or whatever it is now, versus getting it from restaurants or bars. So there is a supply chain. Take away people's hoarding and all those things, and packing freezers full of frozen meat enough to last weeks, if not months. I mean, will there be, do we need to be flexible when we open? You know what I mean? Will there be things that, may be out of stock, temporarily, of course. So again, just as we want our guests to be patient with us, we're going to have to give that same courtesy to our suppliers, because I mean, they're just as anxious to have us back as we are to be back open. But yeah, I don't foresee any major food shortages. I mean, just with Feed Albany, we're doing a lot of work with the regional food bank, and I mean, they're despite the incredible demand they have right now, there's no shortage of food there. So it's not something I have any concern for right now.
So if you guys have any last questions, if you want to type them in the chat on the sidebar, if you have ideas that you want the BIDs to work on, or some advocacy that maybe we could work with the New York State Restaurant Association on, you can email that to myself, to Katie, to Jevin, to Jim or Anthony. We'd be happy to help in those ways, because it is, I think that you'll also see in some of the different cities or counties, hopefully some additional funding resources that will be coming online as people are starting to think about reopening and getting ready to reopen. So I know we send out a ton of emails, but please really check our Facebook pages and emails from all the BIDs, because we'll make sure that as soon as we know financial programs that are available, financial assistance, we'll make sure that we get that out to you guys.
Georgette, I just wanted to add that we've been able to be in contact with some folks from the governor's office and the state liquor authority, and they're actually going to be providing masks. It's sounds like a lot. I'm just not sure how much it's going to end up being compared to. I think it's going to be a very healthy supply. They have 900,000 reusable face masks that they're providing for delivery workers and restaurant employees across the state. So we're anticipating getting a good supply of those in many of the upstate communities as well as some downstate communities. And as soon as we get those, I'll share that information with you, and happy to work with the BIDs to help get those out to all types of restaurants across the state.
So sorry. So one other question I had was about liability, and is there concern about liability for the restaurants? Is there a thought that the customers would be signing a waiver when they come in, much like the ski area lift tickets? What is the thought on that?
I mean, I think there's liability. I think there's lots of liability issues to running a restaurant every day, no matter what, all the time. Is there an increased liability that if someone were to get COVID-19 in your restaurant? Sure. Reputationally, it's a huge hit to the restaurant too, especially with all this tracing that's now going to be taking place. If everybody in the community suddenly found out that 10 people got COVID-19 because they ate at your restaurant last night, it is a problem, no doubt. One of the concerns we're looking at more in terms of, the way things were shut down so quickly and rapidly is in terms of some of you hopefully have heard about this WARN Act requirement. When you shut down and lay people off, there's requirements under state law, there's requirements under federal law that you provide notice. We're looking at those types of liability issues and trying to make sure restaurants are protected from unintended consequences. You didn't have time to react and follow all the guidelines because you were forced to shut down immediately. So we want to make sure things like, labor law requirements under the WARN Act didn't have to be followed. And we are working with a coalition on that. There's a Lawsuit Reform Alliance group that we're working with on a lot of the liability issues. But yeah, of course, there's liability to letting a customer walk in your restaurant on any given day of the week on any situation. Sure.
Sorry, there was another question here. Anthony, do you want to just ask your question? Sorry.
Yeah, just of the restaurant owners, I'm kind of curious if they're looking for like a cloth or paper mask for wait staff and/or kitchen people, or is it a face shield, the plastic like that are being replicated, with plastic shields that can be replaced? What's the preference if you have to do something?
Dominic, are you seeing that you're wanting something different for your wait staff versus your kitchen staff, or?
I mean, I really haven't even gotten as far as wait staff yet. I mean, obviously with Feed Albany, we've been in the kitchen almost every day, and we're wearing masks. It gets hot, and it's not even hot in the kitchen yet, as it's only in springtime. It's not comfortable. I'll be honest. So it's we had discussed face shields in another call, and I think that would certainly give you a little more breathing room, but still, give you enough protection, from that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly an option. Somebody jokingly said a hockey helmet maybe could be a good thing with a plexiglass mask. But yeah, so I mean, I think something that gives you that breathability. I mean, is it going to be sexy? Absolutely not. Is it going to be awkward? Yeah. But are we doing what's best to protect public health? Yes. So if we want to get back to the way things were on February 28th, this is what it's the shared sacrifice. We're going to have to do it. Yeah, it's awkward and it's uncomfortable, but unfortunately it is a sign of the times now.
Yeah, Wexler posted in the chat, the state masks that we'll be receiving are Hanes cloth, I think he said, and they are supposed to be washable and reusable. I do expect that they would be more popular for the wait staff than they would for the kitchen staff. We are hearing that the face shield is preferred for the kitchen staff, but they're free.
There was another question about, public spaces, open container. And so I can only speak to, and were we working in our various cities to try to work on the sidewalk cafe and patio hours. So I can only speak to what we're doing in Albany, and then I'll open it to Katie or Jim. So we have collectively, the 3 Albany bids have submitted a request to the city of Albany. We are waiting, and by waiting, I need to do a follow-up phone call. So I don't want to say waiting on them, but we've asked for expedited permitting process, because we want to make sure that everyone's able to have their patio open, and we're not sure who's been deemed essential at City Hall, and so what that approval process is or will be. We're talking with them about possibly making larger sidewalk cafes. We've talked about the idea of parklets. There's been a request made about potentially the idea of music on patios, which I believe is currently not allowed. And so we are having those conversations with the city and hope to have some answers in the next week or so. So that is definitely happening, trying to get creative. We haven't talked to them yet, but we've been talking internally about could we use some of the parks? Would it be as a beer garden? Could it be as extended seating? Unfortunately for at least downtown, not all of we only have one restaurant, it seems like, around each park, so it doesn't totally work, but we're trying to sort of reimagine side streets, public spaces, is there an opportunity for additional restaurant space? So those conversations are happening in Albany. And I don't know if Jim or Katie have anything to add about Troy or Schenectady.
We had started, sorry, Jim. We had started having conversations about this actually over the last year. As we start to talk about, there's a Franklin Alley project in the city of Troy, as well as some of the Barker Park space and some of the other spaces that we've been trying to look at. We'd also been talking about the summer square that happened last year, which is around Monument Square, and doing that again this summer. Those conversations have stalled a little bit, but it's still on the forefront of what we're going to be talking about. We have created a countywide group, so I'm assuming those are conversations we'll be having within Rensselaer and Hoosick as well. So definitely we'll be in touch about that, and whatever guidelines you guys have put together through Albany would be great to keep those in mind too.
In Schenectady, we actually had an initial meeting with the mayor and some other city staff and board members last week to begin discussing the whole reopening strategy. And we really did focus a lot on restaurants because a lot of our conversation revolved around what we're talking about today, and a lot of the focus on, with the warmer weather coming, the opportunities for rethinking outside space to mitigate the issues with people maybe not being as comfortable sitting close together in inside spaces. So really doing an inventory of the available patio spaces around downtown, but much like Georgette was saying, we had discussions about the possibility of guerrilla placemaking, creating outside spaces for dining and gathering that aren't currently there, and if they tend to work, we could look at doing a permanent plan for doing some permanent improvements to make those spaces available. We talked about the idea of that was brushed on a little bit earlier about parking spaces along sidewalks, how to reuse those possibly as walking spaces or as additional seating. And even with the reduced amount of traffic in the public parking lots, is there a way to maybe take those and create spaces where people can still get their food, come out, sit, have a meal together, entertainment. So it sounds like we're thinking a lot of the same ideas, and we're planning on having after our statewide call on Friday and after this call today, we're going to be regathering with the city leaders to be discussing next steps. And on this call, actually, we've been having some conversations with a restaurant owner about doing something specifically in our downtown similar to this as well, because to look at our unique needs. So that's where we are.
Well, so we are slightly over, so I just want to make sure I'm not keeping everyone. So we will, again, send a link of this recording. We will send the National Restaurant Association recommended or proposed guidelines, I guess. We will send the New York Promise, the New York Restaurant Association Promise. And then we will, the hope is that over the next several weeks, the state working with the New York Restaurant Association will develop some of these guidelines, and that whether it makes sense to maybe do another one of those once those guidelines have been developed, or to email them out to everyone. Because, again, it might be best practices versus you have to do this. And in some places, it maybe you actually have to do this. So it might be some combination of that. But really so that we can all understand that we're making sure we meet all the guidelines in order to be able to reopen when that time comes. But so I want to thank Melissa and Dominic. I want to thank you all for attending. And if there's other questions that maybe we haven't answered, please, again, reach out to your respective business improvement districts, and we will happily get you answers, because we know that everyone is anxiously awaiting being able to reopen. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, because we know it's at least coming. And thank you again all for participating.